The day Mara Quinn covered her irrigation ditches with what the farmers called useless weeds, they laughed and said her dead land was beyond saving. They stood at the fence line in the hot afternoon dust, watching her spread thick green plants across the water as if she were planting failure where water was supposed to flow. To them, it looked like grief had finally broken her. A young woman alone on a dying farm, wasting her last chance on ditch weeds. But Mara had found something in her father's field journal that none of those men had bothered to notice. A question written in the margin beside a sketch of the irrigation channels. What if the ditch could feed the field, not just water it? And before the county understood what she was growing, those so-called useless weeds would begin waking the land from the roots up. In the summer of 1972, Mara Quinn was 25 years old when she inherited the Quinn farm, a tired stretch of land sitting low and flat under the burning southern sun. It was not the kind of inheritance people dreamed about. It came with a farmhouse that leaned slightly to the east, porch boards that creaked like old bones, and a barn roof patched with tin sheets her father had nailed down during storms. The tractor still ran, but only after coughing black smoke into the morning air. The pickup had one working headlight. The fences sagged. The ditches were clogged and still. But none of those things frightened Mara as much as the soil. The soil had gone pale. Not light brown, not sandy. Pale. As if the life had been pulled out of it year after year until only the body remained. When it rained, the water ran over the surface instead of sinking in. When the sun came out, the ground crusted hard. The crops came up weak, yellow and thin, like they were already tired before they had begun. At the feed store, men spoke of the Quinn farm in the past tense. Her daddy fought that place as long as he could. Land's worn out. She ought to sell before it eats her alive. Mara heard it all. She heard it when they thought she was too far away to listen. She heard it in the pauses when she walked into the co-op. She heard it in the careful sympathy of women who told her she was still young enough to start over somewhere else. But Mara did not want somewhere else. That farm had her father's footprints in it. His hands had fixed those gates. His back had bent over those rows. His voice still seemed to live in the evenings when the wind moved across the ditch grass. So when everyone else looked at the farm and saw failure, Mara saw one unfinished conversation between her father and the land. And she was not ready to let that conversation end. Her father, Elias Quinn, had not been an educated man in the way county officials respected education. He did not speak in technical phrases. He did not own polished shoes. He had never stood behind a podium at a farmers' meeting. But he had spent 40 years watching that land more closely than most men watch their own children. He noticed where the soil held moisture, where the weeds grew first, where the frogs returned after rain, where the crop rows stayed greener near a ditch outlet. He noticed smells, textures, water color, the difference between ground that was only wet and ground that was alive. And he wrote everything down. After his death, Mara found his field journals in the bottom drawer of his old desk. They were not neat books. They were stained with fingerprints, rain spots, grease smudges, and soil pressed into the edges of the pages. But to Mara, they were more valuable than money. At first, she read them because she missed him. Then she read them because she realized her father had spent his final years trying to solve the mystery of why the farm was dying. Page after page returned to the same problem. The land was not simply dry. It was hungry. The ditches were not simply channels. They were wasted opportunities. One entry from 1969 caught her attention. Her father had written, "The ditch carries water across the field, but the water carries nothing back. it passes through empty. A few pages later, he had drawn a crude sketch of an irrigation ditch. Along the edges were floating green plants, tiny circles, arrows, notes about cooler water, shade, and green matter breaking down near the gates. At the bottom of the page, in handwriting, that looked weaker than the earlier entries, he had written the line Mara would never forget. Maybe the ditch should feed the field, not just water it. Mara stared at that sentence for a long time. The idea was strange, maybe even foolish. But her father had not written it like a fantasy. He had written it like a man who had seen something no one else cared enough to study. That was where the useless weeds began. Not in a store, not in a government pamphlet, not in a salesman's pitch. They began in a dying man's observation that living water might still wake dead soil. At the co-op, the answer was simple. Fertilizer, more of it, stronger doses, better blends, chemical correction. The county advisor had charts. The salesman had brochures. The bank had forms. Everyone spoke as if the farm's problem had already been solved somewhere else, and all Mara needed to do was buy the solution. Your soil is depleted, they told her. You can't bring crops back with hope. You need nitrogen. You need a serious program. You need credit. Credit. That word sat behind every polite suggestion. The fertilizer was expensive. The herbicide was expensive. The fuel was expensive. The repairs were expensive. The proper way to save the farm required money Mara did not have, which meant debt she did not want. Her father had warned her about debt, not because all debt was evil, but because farm debt had a way of arriving as a tool and staying as a master. He had once told her, "Banks don't harvest with you, Mara. They only arrive after." That sentence stayed with her. So when the county men said the land needed purchased inputs, Mara thought of her father's journal. When they said the ditch only carried water, she thought of the sketch. When they said her farm was too far gone, she thought of the one thing the land still had. Water moving through it. Not much, not clean, not rich, but water. And in her father's mind, water had never been empty. It was either dead or alive. Mara found the plant in a low, wet place behind an abandoned rice field 10 miles away. At first glance, it looked like pond scum. A floating green carpet of tiny leaves, soft and dense, spreading across still water. Most farmers hated the sight of it. It clogged slow ditches, blocked sunlight, made water look dirty. Men scraped it out and cursed it. But Mara recognized it from her father's sketch. She knelt at the edge of the water and lifted a handful. It was delicate, almost weightless. Tiny green leaves clustered together so tightly they formed a living mat. The old man who owned the abandoned place laughed when she asked if she could take some. "You want that mess?" he said. "Yes, sir. You're welcome to all the weeds you can carry." He thought she was doing him a favor. Mara loaded baskets, tubs, and feed sacks with the floating plants. By the time she returned home, the bed of her pickup looked like it was full of green velvet. She drove to the main irrigation ditch, parked beside the water, and began spreading the plants by hand. The first handful floated outward and gathered against the bank. The second spread wider. Soon a section of the ditch was covered in green. That was when Roy Pritchard saw her. Roy farmed the property west of hers. He was 57, thick-armed, loud-voiced, and proud of never needing a woman or a college man to tell him how to grow a creep. He stopped his tractor near the fence and watched her for a while. Then he shouted, "Mara Quinn, what are you doing now?" Mara looked up, her gloves dripping green water. "Putting plants in the ditch." Roy squinted. "Plants? Yes." He leaned forward on the tractor wheel. "Those are weeds." Mara did not answer. Roy laughed. Not gently, not kindly. The kind of laugh that invites others to join before they are even there. You're growing weeds in your irrigation now? Mara stood slowly. I'm growing life. Roy laughed harder. By nightfall, the whole county had a new joke. Mara Quinn was farming ditchweeds. Have you ever been so sure of something that everyone else's laughter started to feel like a test? That was where Mara stood. Not with proof. Not yet. Only with her father's journal, a dying farm, and a ditch full of plants everyone called useless. If you enjoy stories about people who hold on when nobody believes in them, subscribe and stay with this one. Because Mara's proof did not come quickly. It came the hard way. Act 5. The laughter spreads. The jokes started at the feed store. Ask Mara if she's selling weed hay. Maybe the Quinn place is becoming a swamp. Guess crops don't matter if you can harvest ditches. At the diner, someone said she should put a sign by the road. Quinn Weed Farm. Men laughed into coffee cups. Some shook their heads with pity. Others made her into a warning. A young woman left alone too soon. Too stubborn to listen. Too sentimental about her father's ideas. Too proud to admit she needed help. And that was the part that hurt most. They framed her decision as grief, as if loving her father made her foolish, as if trusting his notes meant she had lost her own judgment. Mara did not argue. She kept working. Every morning she checked the ditches. She watched how the green plants spread. She opened and closed gates. She used a rake to keep some sections from becoming too thick. She gathered excess plants into piles and mixed them with manure, straw, and kitchen scraps behind the barn. Some went back into the ditch. Some became compost. Some broke down into a dark, wet mass she later spread near the weakest field edges. She was not just letting weeds grow wild. She was managing a system. But from the road it looked ridiculous. A young woman feeding ditches instead of fields. That was all they saw. The official visit came 6 weeks later. Walter Hensley, the county agricultural advisor, arrived in a clean truck with county lettering on the door and a clipboard tucked under one arm. He was polite. That made it worse. Rudeness can be answered. Polite condescension wraps itself in concern. Mara, he said, standing beside the green ditch, I've heard some talk around town. I imagine you have. He looked at the floating plants. Do you know what this is? Mara wiped her hands on her jeans. My father called it azolla. Hensley's eyebrows lifted. That was the first time anyone in the county heard the real name. Not ditchweed. Not pond scum. Not green mess. Azolla. A tiny floating water plant, known in some old farming systems for growing fast and enriching water when managed correctly. But Hensley was not impressed. Mara, even if that is what you think it is, this is not how commercial farming works. How does it work? She asked. He glanced at her, unsure whether she was challenging him. It works through measured inputs, soil testing, fertility programs, proper nutrient application, not by allowing weeds to clog irrigation. They aren't clogging it. They will. I'm controlling the spread. He sighed. Mara, your father was a good man, but good men can be wrong. Your land needs real fertility, nitrogen, phosphorus, potash, a plan. I have a plan. He looked at the ditch again. This is not a plan. This is a distraction. The words landed harder than she expected, not because she respected him more than her father, but because part of her feared he might be right. Hensley scribbled something on the clipboard. Then he said, You still have time to correct course. Mara looked over the dry fields, then back at the green water. I'm going to see it through. He closed the clipboard. Then I hope you can afford the lesson. A month later, at a farmers' meeting, Hensley used her as an example. He did not say her name at first. He didn't have to. Everyone knew. He warned the room against unscientific experiments driven by desperation. When he mentioned a farmer trying to restore exhausted land with floating ditchweeds, laughter filled the hall. Mara was not there, but Roy Pritchard made sure she heard about it. Not long after that, Daniel Voss drove up to the Quinn farm. Voss sold fertilizer for one of the largest suppliers in the region. He did not come laughing. That was his skill. He came with sympathy. He wore a pressed shirt, clean boots, and a gentle expression that looked practiced in mirrors. "Mara," he said, "I heard what people have been saying. I want you to know I don't take pleasure in it." She said nothing. "I also heard about your father. He had a reputation as a careful man." "He was." Voss nodded slowly. "I respect that. But sometimes careful people wait too long to ask for help." There it was. The opening. He walked beside her toward the field and explained that his company could provide a full fertility package on seasonal credit. No payment until after harvest. Enough nitrogen to push the crop. Enough chemical support to bring the fields back into production. Enough professional guidance to get people to stop laughing. He did not say that last part. He did not need to. Mara understood exactly what he was offering. He was offering normal. And normal is tempting when you have become the county joke. She could sign the papers, spray the fields, kill the weeds, buy fertilizer, stand in line with every other farmer, and feel the relief of being ordinary again. Voss leaned against his car. "You don't have to carry this alone," he said. "There's no shame in using what works." Mara looked toward the ditch where the green mat moved gently in the afternoon wind. "My father said dead is a quiet flood," she replied. "You don't notice how deep it is until your feet leave the ground." Voss smiled, but his eyes hardened. "Poetry won't save your crop." "No," Mara said, "but neither will a bill I can't pay." He straightened. "You're risking everything for weeds." "I'm risking everything either way." "Then at least risk it on something proven." Mara turned to face him. "Proven by who?" He had no answer that did not sound like a sales pitch, so he left her standing in the yard, more alone than before. "Let me ask you honestly. If you were Mara, would you have taken the offer? A full season of fertilizer on credit. A chance to stop being mocked. A chance to look sensible again. Or would you have stayed with the strange method no one believed in? Tell me in the comments, because this is the moment where most people don't fail from weakness. They fail from wanting relief. The county called them weeds because that was the easiest way to dismiss them. But Mara's father had studied them differently. Azolla was not impressive to look at one plant at a time. It was tiny, soft, almost fragile, but together it formed a living skin across still water. It grew fast. It shaded the ditch, keeping the water cooler. It gave shelter to insects and microorganisms. When managed carefully, it could be harvested, composted, and returned to the soil. And most importantly, it was part of a living fertility cycle. Azolla has a relationship with nitrogen-fixing organisms that can help turn atmospheric nitrogen into forms life can use. Mara did not explain it like a scientist. She explained it like her father had written it. The green mat catches life from the air, the water carries it, and the field receives it slowly. That was the idea, not magic, not instant fertilizer, a system. She let azolla grow in controlled sections of the ditch. She skimmed excess growth before it blocked water flow. She composted part of it with manure and straw. She returned part of it to the field edges, and each irrigation carried tiny pieces of green matter, dissolved nutrients and biological activity into soil that had gone too long without being fed gently. The ditches changed first. Their sour smell faded. The water no longer looked as lifeless. Frogs returned earlier. Dragonflies hovered over the banks. Small signs, easy to laugh at if you only respected numbers. But Mara's father had taught her that land speaks in small signs before it speaks in harvests. So she listened. The first year gave Mara nothing she could use to silence anyone. That is the part people forget about patience. It does not reward you immediately for choosing it. The ditches were green. The fields were still weak. The crops grew, but not beautifully. Some rows yellowed. Some areas remained thin. From the road, Roy Pritchard's fields looked better because he had borrowed hard and fertilized heavily. His crops had a bright, forced green that made Mara's look dull by comparison. Men pointed that out whenever they could. Look at Roy's field. That's what real farming looks like. Mara's growing salad in the ditch and dust in the rows. She heard it. She kept working. The second year was harder. A heat wave settled over the county in June. The air became thick and still. The ditch banks cracked. Her crops curled at the edges. For the first time, Mara wondered whether she had mistaken stubbornness for faith. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with the bank envelope unopened beside her. Inside was an offer. Credit. Enough to buy the inputs everyone said she needed. She touched the envelope and imagined signing it. The relief came first, then the shame, then the fear. She pushed the envelope away and opened her father's journal. The page she found was not the famous line about feeding the field. It was another note, written in a weaker hand. If the water only passes through, the field stays hungry. Mara read it again. Then she looked through the window toward the dark outline of the ditches. The land had been hungry for years. It was unfair to demand that one season of green plants undo decades of exhaustion. That night she burned the bank envelope in the stove, not because she was certain, because she had chosen. And sometimes choosing is the only certainty you get. Would you have lasted through that second year? No applause, no clear proof, just heat, weak crops, and people laughing harder because you hadn't proven them wrong yet. Drop a comment with one word: stay or quit. Because Mara's whole life changed, because she chose to stay. The first real sign came near the western ditch outlet. Mara noticed the soil there had darkened. Not dramatically, not enough for a neighbor to see from the road, but enough for her to kneel and take a handful. It crumbled differently, less like dust, more like earth. Then the smell changed. Living soil has a smell, deep, clean, almost sweet after rain. Dead soil smells like powder and heat. Mara began finding that living smell in small patches near the water channels. Then came worms. The first earthworm appeared under a damp strip near the ditch bank. Mara held it in her palm and laughed until she cried. Because to anyone else, it was only a worm. To her, it was a verdict. Life was returning. By the third year, the crop rows nearest the irrigation channel showed a deeper green. Not the loud, artificial green of overfed plants. A steadier green. A rooted green. The kind that did not vanish the moment stress arrived. She took soil samples. She labeled them carefully. Near ditch, middle field, far edge. Then she mailed them to a state lab under her own name. When the report came back, she opened it with trembling hands. Organic matter was still low, but improving. Microbial activity was higher near the irrigated sections. Available nitrogen was moderate but more stable than before. The recommendation still advised commercial fertilizer. Of course it did. But Mara saw what mattered. The land had moved, not enough to impress the county, enough to prove to her that the system was alive. The public proof came in the 5th year. A dry season hit the county hard. Not a total disaster. Worse in some ways. A season just dry enough to expose who had soil and who only had crops. Fields that had been pushed hard with chemicals looked good early, then began to suffer when the stress held. The topsoil dried. Irrigation water seemed to run off instead of sink in. Plants yellowed at the lower leaves. The county grew nervous. Roy Pritchard ran his pumps day and night. The fuel bills climbed. The bank calls started. But Mara's land behaved differently. The ditch system was not perfect. Nothing about farming is. But her soil held moisture longer. The crop rose near the channels stayed greener. The ground did not crust as badly. The roots held. And by late summer, the difference could be seen from the road. That was when the laughter stopped. Not all at once. Laughter rarely dies suddenly. It fades, first into confusion, then into silence, then into questions asked quietly where pride can hide. What's she doing over there? Why are her rows still green? Did she fertilize and not tell anyone? Roy Pritchard drove past 3 times in one afternoon. The third time he stopped. He stood at the fence line with his hat in his hand, staring at the ditch. Mara saw him from the field but did not go over. Some silences deserve to stand. At harvest, the numbers made denial difficult. Mara's yield beat expectations, not by a miracle, by enough. Enough to matter. Enough to make her expenses look embarrassingly low compared to those who had borrowed heavily. Enough for the co-op conversation to change. The men who once called her the ditchweed girl stopped saying it where she could hear. But she knew. The land had begun answering louder than they could laugh. Walter Hensley came back the following spring. This time his truck was not quite as clean. Or maybe Mara simply saw him differently. He walked the ditch with her again, the same way he had years before. But now he was slower to speak. The water moved under a controlled green cover, not clogged, not sour, not wild, managed. He looked at the ditch outlets, at the darker strips of soil, at the crop rows already coming in strong. Finally he said, "You've changed the system." Mara almost smiled. "No," she said. "I started listening to the one that was already here." He nodded, though she could tell he still wanted categories, rates, programs, transferable steps, a neat explanation that could fit on a county handout. But the truth did not fit neatly, because the azolla was only one part. The compost mattered. The water timing mattered. The ditch management mattered. The observation mattered. Her father's notes mattered. Patience mattered most of all. Hensley cleared his throat. "I may have judged too quickly." That was as close to an apology as a man like him could reach. Mara accepted it without making him say more, because she had not waited 5 years for his approval. She had waited for the land. Daniel Voss returned after the harvest numbers spread. His smile was different now, less confident, more calculating. He congratulated her. Then he asked questions. How much azolla did she start with? How fast did it grow? Could the method be packaged? Could farmers buy starter cultures? Could the company create a biological ditch management program? Could Mara consult? Could they use her story? He spoke faster as the possibilities unfolded in his mind. What he saw was a new product, a new market, a way to sell natural farming with the same hunger he had once used to sell chemicals. Mara listened. Then she said, "You still don't understand." Voss stopped. "This isn't about selling weeds to farmers." "It could help them," he said. "It can help them," Mara replied, "but not if you turn it into another shortcut in a bag." His jaw tightened. "That's not fair." "No," Mara said. What wasn't fair was telling desperate farmers the only answer was debt. He looked away. Mara pointed toward the ditch. "My father didn't leave me a product. He left me a question. That question made me watch the land closely enough to learn what it needed. Voss had no sales language for that. So, for the second time, he left the Quinn farm without making a deal. Only this time, Mara did not feel alone after he drove away. The fields were green behind her. Over the next decade, the Quinn farm changed. Not into something flashy, not into a showplace built for visitors, into something healthier. The soil darkened. The crops grew stronger. The ditches became living channels instead of stagnant cuts through the land. Birds returned. Frogs returned. Earthworms became ordinary again, which was the best miracle of all. The farmhouse porch was repaired. The barn roof was replaced. The old tractor somehow kept running. Mara filled new journals beside her father's old ones. Her handwriting became steadier over the years, less desperate, more patient. She recorded what worked and what failed, where azolla grew too thick, where water needed more movement, where composted plants helped most, where soil responded slowly, where she had been wrong. That was one of the things that made Mara different from the men who had mocked her. She allowed the land to correct her. They had wanted to be right. She wanted to learn. Eventually, other farmers came quietly, not in groups, never at first. Pride prefers private visits. One man asked whether she would show him how she managed the ditch gates. Another asked where she found the plant. Another brought a jar of his own ditch water and asked if it smelled dead to her. And Roy Pritchard, older now, came one evening without his usual voice. He stood by the fence and looked across the green field. "You were right," he said. Mara leaned on the gate. "No," she said after a while. "My father was listening before any of us were." Roy nodded. That was enough. Years later, the field journal still sat on the desk in the Quinn farmhouse. The original one, Elias Quinn's. The page with the sketch of the ditch had been handled so many times the corner was soft. Beside it were Mara's journals, stacked high. 50 seasons of questions, answers, failures, corrections, and patient observation. One afternoon, Mara walked the ditch with her niece's young son. He was 12, curious, restless, the way children are before they understand that quiet things can be powerful. He looked at the floating green plants and asked, "Aunt Mara, are those weeds?" She smiled. "That depends who's looking." He frowned. "What are they really?" She knelt beside the ditch and lifted a small handful of azolla from the water. "They're proof," she said. "Proof of what?" That useless is a word people use when they don't understand what something is for yet. The boy looked at the water, then at the fields, then back at the tiny green plants in her hand. And Mara knew the lesson had entered him, even if it would take years to grow. Just like the land. The men who mocked Mara Quinn thought they were laughing at weeds, but they were really laughing at patience, at observation, at the kind of wisdom that does not arrive wearing a clean shirt or carrying a clipboard. They looked at her irrigation ditches and saw a mess. Mara looked at the same water and saw a living system waiting to be restored. They saw worthless plants. She saw food for the soil. They saw a young woman wasting time. She saw her father's unfinished question. And in the end, the land answered for her. Not loudly, not quickly, but completely. The ditches turned green first. Then the soil darkened. Then the worms returned. Then the crops stood taller. Then the fields that everyone had written off began breathing again. That is what people missed. The land did not come back to life because Mara forced it. It came back because she fed what was still alive beneath the surface. And maybe that is the lesson beyond farming. Sometimes the thing everyone calls useless is only waiting for someone patient enough to understand it. Sometimes revival begins as something small, strange, and easy to mock. And sometimes the people laughing at the ditch are the last ones to notice the whole field turning green. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more stories about land, legacy, patience, and the quiet people who prove the world wrong without shouting. And before you go, tell me this in the comments. What really saved Mara's farm? Was it the weeds? Was it her father's journal? Or was it the patience to keep going before the proof arrived?